Okay, I think it is 1 o'clock. So we'll go ahead and get started because I know people have places they need to be. I don't know who technically is hosting which university.
This time still the CMU, the hosting of this time.
Oh, CMU. Okay.
Yes, from CMU, and maybe let me introduce our moderator for these sessions. And she is Dr. Supanika Lushalasani, and she is will take this place. Okay, I will give the floor to Ajahn Supanika to introduce the paper and about the presenter here a bit, and maybe yourself a bit. Ajahn Supanika ครับ
Good afternoon, everyone. I think we have met Jessica one time in Bangkok. And yes, okay, thank you very much. It is, I am here with Ajahn Piyalak, and we both going to help each other in moderating this. And thank you very much, Quentin Lipman, for the presentation. I really don't know how formal this is, but I guess we can start for the paper, the hierarchy of partner preferences. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So can I start?
Yes, you can start. Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm very happy to present our paper. It's a joint work with Khushbu Chauhana from the University of York. So the paper is entitled The Hierarchy of Partner Preferences. And as you will quickly understand, the goal of the paper is fairly simple. It's to try to document the evolution of partner preferences over the long run in Western and non-Western countries, and try to understand why they evolved in such a way. So the starting point of the paper is, well, an obvious fact, which is that who marries whom has important implication on several outcomes. It has a first important implication on the level of inequality across households. So if all the rich people marry together and all the poor people marry together, the level of inequality would be higher than in the case where they mix. Secondly, who marries whom is going to determine how you educate your children and the intergenerational transmission of inequality, because how you educate them determines what they become later. And finally, who marries whom also determines the bargaining power of each spouse, and ultimately the division of labor within the couple and the level of gender inequality within the couple. So who marries whom has important implication on several outcomes, and that's why it's important to understand what determines who marries whom. Why are people married this way in real life? So there are two broad sets of determinants that have been highlighted well in the literature. The first set is quite obvious. It's the preferences. Who you're going to marry is going to be determined by your preference, who you want to meet, what the ideal partner looks like, and what well the characteristics, the ideal characteristics of our partner from your perspective. But the thing is that most of the time, or sometimes, it's not possible to marry your ideal partner. Why? Because we are constrained by the marriage market characteristics. Who we can marry is determined by who we can meet, and where do we meet people? Well, most of the time it's at work, it's during school, it's during your hobbies. So there is a possibility of a mismatch between your preferences and who you end up marrying. And that's why when we take some survey or administrative data and just look at who is married to whom, it's difficult to infer the preferences by just looking at final matches. And this paper, well, it attempts to document the evolution of preferences, so the evolution of the first set of determinants, who people want to marry in the long. So how do we measure this preference? Well, there are two approaches in the literature. So a first approach tends to look at final matches. So after couples have paired. So basically, this approach consists in taking some administrative or survey data, looking at final matches, who is married to whom, build some structural models or use some descriptive approaches, make some assumptions, and infer preferences backwards. The thing is that different preferences can coincide with the same situation. And this approach relies on sometimes quite restrictive assumptions. So that's why there is a second approach that consists in looking at before pairing, so before couples have matched, looking at what individuals look for on dating market. So this approach takes what we call unconventional data, because it's not administrative or survey data. It's data from, for instance, online dating, speed dating, very specific surveys, or matrimonial apps. And this paper that I'm presenting today uses the second approach, so the before pairing approach over the long term. So what's important to understand in this literature is that there is a very large literature describing preferences at one point in time. So what we know, for instance, is what in 2010 preferences look like in a given country, basically from the study, for instance, of online dating. But this literature is very limited on the historical evolution. So in the historical evolution, the only approach that has been used is the after pairing approach, and there is nothing coming from the before pairing approach. So how are we going to reach our objective or reach our goal? Well, by basically building a new data set of matrimonial ads. So these matrimonial ads, they're also called in different countries personal ads or linear ads. I'm not sure what they're called in Thailand, but basically what they consist of is what you can see at the bottom of your screen. It's ads where individuals, they would, for instance, write to a newspaper, describe themselves, say, for instance, on the bottom left of your screen, I am a man, age 38, 5 feet tall, and so on. And then describe the ideal partner. So I would like to meet a single girl, age 30, 35 years, 5 feet tall, no divorces or triflers, that kind of thing. And in this paper, well, we've basically assembled a new data set of matrimonial ads over the long run that we're going to analyze. So the goal of the paper is to document the evolution of partner preferences. The data we're using is matrimonial ads. We have two sources of data. So first, we have one source that comes from the time series from 1950 to 1995, stemming from three countries, Canada, France, and India. That's about 360,000 ads. And then we also have a cross-sectional data set just in 1995 of about 420,000 ads in 45 English-speaking outlets. So this data set, it's text. It's not, let's say, a conventional data set which is quantitative. It's only text where people describe themselves, describe their ideal partner. So what we're going to use is some basic text analysis method. Basically, what we're going to do, just to give you a brief insight, but I will come back on that later, is to categorize the words inside the matrimonial ads into 4 criteria. So these 4 criteria are the economic, personality, taste, and physical criteria. We're going to say this word refers to the economic criterion or the personality criterion, and then compute the evolution of this criteria over the long run using some dictionaries. Our main results are the following. So first, using the time series from 1950 to 1995, in the 2 Western countries, so in France and Canada, what we document is a decline of the demand for economic criteria and a rise of personality criteria. That's really the main result of this paper, is that in France and Canada, in 1950, economic criteria were the most sought for criteria in the matrimonial ads. So for instance, individuals, they were looking for people with good financial situation, good economic means, and so on. And this progressively declined. At the same time, there is a rise of personality criteria, which consists, for instance, in looking for people who are fun, who are nice, who are loving, who have a sense of humor, and so on. As for the taste and physical criteria, in the two Western countries, we observe a relative stability of the two criteria. In India, on the opposite, which is a non-Western country, in our data set, we don't see a decline of economic criteria. On the opposite, there is a relative stability of the four criteria over the time. So then, using our data sets, cross-sectional data sets in 1995, from 45 English-speaking outlets from Canada and the US, what we're going to document is that personality criteria are consistently ranked as the most sought for criteria in all these newspapers. So in all these 45 newspapers, we find that personality criteria are the number one criteria that are sought for in a potential partner, and that economic criteria are the least sought for criteria, so the least demanded. We argue that these findings are consistent with theories describing family changes in Western countries in the 1960s, 1970s. So I will come back on that in 2 slides. But around these times in Western countries, family changed a lot. The marriage rate declined a lot, the divorce rate increased. And there are theories that have argued that these changes, they reflect the fact that marriage has been increasingly based on the notion of companionship and love. And what we document here is what we call a shift from material to non-material needs. People used to ask for economic criteria, and now they're asking for personality criteria. And that's what we call the hierarchy of partner preferences. The fact that there is a kind of pyramid. Once material needs are satisfied, we move on to the next set of needs, which are the non-material ones. And obviously, when we're using matrimonial ads, so matrimonial ads, these are not representative surveys of the population. We are aware of that. And so it comes with some limitations that I will try to address in greater details later during the discussion. So in terms of contributions to the literature, our paper contributes to 3 strands of the literature. So very quickly, there is a very large literature on that question. Obviously, why? Because who marries whom? Well, it's quite important. It's something that has important implication and very important outcome. So there is this literature first on the evolution of marital sorting in the long term that has tried to basically understand whether this marital sorting, so the characteristics of spouses married together, is determined by marriage market characteristics or preferences. It's always difficult to disentangle the two. What we do is that we document stated preferences. We show the importance of personality traits and the decline of economic criteria. Secondly, there is also this literature, very large, that has described what has happened in Western countries in the 1960s, 1970s. This literature has been mainly descriptive, coming with some theories that have not been empirically tested. And what we do here is that we kind of test them and suggest that the transformation were accompanied by a shift in preferences. And finally, on the literature, identifying partner preferences. So what's important to understand here is that, well, it's a big question, obviously, but to our knowledge, so there is only one other paper that has tried to document the evolution of partner preferences over the long run. It's Best and Coulter in 2001 using specific surveys in the US. Here we kind of generalized a paper I've done and published last year in the Journal of Economic History, just focusing on the case of France, assembling a new data set of matrimonial ads from different countries and trying to explain the findings. So moving on to the context, what's important, well, to understand for this presentation is just this slide. To keep in mind while I will present the result, is that during the second half of the 20th century, well, Western family underwent a very profound change. So there was this very large drop in marriage rate, the surge in divorce rate, cohabitation, the fact of living with someone you're not married to became commonplace. Fertility was postponed, it was sometimes done outside marriage. And kind of these changes, well, they've been described in different disciplines. For instance, in economics, Baker in 1981 in the Treatise of Family, where he talks about the radical alteration of the family, saying that perhaps at that time, family in the Western countries has been destroyed. In demography, well, there is this concept that has been developed of second demographic transition, just to highlight and describe what has been happening in Western countries in the 1960s, 1970s. In sociology, there was this discussion of a deinstitutionalization of marriage. The point is that in the different disciplines of social sciences, well, they describe the same thing using different words, but at the heart of all this concept, there is this hypothesis that perhaps partner preferences have evolved in Western countries. Perhaps they change over that period, in a sense that individualization and self-actualization, so the fact of looking for a partner, not just for financial assistance, but for something greater than that, to get along and self-actualize, well, has become increasingly important, and that looking for a partner has been increasingly based on what we call now love and the notion of companionship. So in terms of data, for the time series, we have the following data sets. So we have data from 3 countries, France, Canada, and India. So in France, the data set is comes from the leader on the matrimonial ad market. It's data from 1950 to 1995, annual data that we digitized ourselves, about nearly 300,000 ads. In Canada, we have data from the main newspapers in the Vancouver area, in the western part of Canada, in British Columbia, coming from a website that is called newspapers.com. In India, we have data from the Times of India, which is the main English-speaking newspapers in India. We have about 60,000 ads collected every 5 years from 1955 to 1995. You may wonder how we collect and why we chose this specific newspaper. Well, it's very simple. We started to digitize ourselves the French data set. Then we looked for other newspapers that were publishing matrimonial ads over this period, so the second half of the 20th century. We searched through the main website that exists, publishing digitized archives of newspapers, such as newspapers.com, which claims to be the largest website doing that, and ProQuest.com. And we only found these 2 newspapers from Canada and India doing that. So matrimonial ads, what's important to understand is that, well, we basically downloaded pages and pages of newspapers, and then it was relatively easy to build our data set based on that, because all these matrimonial ads, they end with a given expression. Here on your screen, you can see 2 pictures of ads published in the Vancouver Sun, the Canadian newspaper, and they both end with the expression box, a given number, then Sun, or Vancouver Sun. So we basically splitted our pages of pictures of matrimonial ads, saying that the end of each ad is this expression. That's the first thing. The second thing is that matrimonial ads, well, it may seem like it's something a bit peculiar to analyze, and in some sense it is. But what's important to understand is that today most people, they study online dating websites, whereas at the end of the 20th century, there were quite a few studies that have studied matrimonial ads. And Coupland in 1996 noted that matrimonial ads, it's always a very standardized language that comes with a supply and a demand side. Supply side where people describe themselves, demand side where they describe their ideal partner. So that's the descriptive statistics on the number of matrimonial ads that we have for the 3 countries, India in orange, Canada in red, and France in blue, for ads written by women on the graph A and ads written by men in graph B. So what we see here is that basically for France, we have about 2,500 ads per year. For Canada, we have about 500, and for India, it evolved a lot towards the end of the century, reaching nearly a few thousand per year. So these matrimonial ads, analyzing these data sets, it's important to keep in mind that it comes with advantages and limitations. The advantages are that people, when they write matrimonial ads, they're free to express their preferences, in the sense that they don't have to answer to a specific survey that asks them, oh, do you rate economic criteria highly or not? No, people, they can just write whatever they want. So there is no predefined category that can omit or distort preferences. Moreover, it's a real life situation with actual consequences, which can potentially change the life of people that will write them. And finally, it's also the only source of data on this question that comes with a historical dimension. In terms of limitation, obviously, it's not a representative survey. It comes with a selection bias, and we will talk about that later. And also, a second question you may ask is, were these ads successful? So in France, for the 20th century, there are estimates on that, which have said that basically around 1 to 3% of marriages were done through these ads. So there is quite a few papers that have studied these matrimonial ads. I list here at the bottom of the screen a few studies on that, doing that from different disciplines. The point is that all these studies, they focused at one point in time, and here is the first look at this data with a historical dimension. So in terms of method, before showing you the result, first here is the structure of an ad. So at the top of your screen, you have an ad that was published in the French newspaper that goes like this: single, 38, secretary, 1.62 m, scene, would correspond with handsome man, good situation, serious. So that's an ad written by a woman looking for a potential male partner. So this ad, it has three parts. The first part is the supply side, where the lady describes herself from single to thin, describes her characteristics and what she looks like, what's her job. The second part is the demand side, where she describes what the ideal partner looks like, from handsome to serious. And the third part is the delimiter that delimits the supply from the demand side, and help us say where the supply ends and where the demand starts. So we created a list of delimiters consisting in verbs that we use to basically split the supply from the demand side of all our matrimonial ads, and managed to split about 90 to 95% of ads. And then doing that, what we do in the paper is that we focus mainly on the demand side. So unless otherwise specified, we're going to focus on the demand side. Now the question is, how do we identify the criteria mentioned in the demand side? So we use dictionary-based methods. So what are dictionary-based methods? It's very simple. It's a keyword search. So first, we computed a list of words, the most common words mentioned in the matrimonial ad, and we classified them into 4 criteria: economic, personality, taste, and physical criteria. So for economic criteria, we use existing papers by De Sanglier in France and Weinfors and Denbach in English to basically map our world to economic criteria, and I will show an examples of the next slide. For personality criteria, we use dictionaries of psychologists. We map the big 5 personality traits into words. So the big 5 personality traits, it's something that was invented by psychologists to basically describe a personality into 5 personality traits using dictionaries built by Goldberg and Boyes and al. For respectively English and French. And for taste and physical criteria, we have come up ourselves with some definitions. So here you can see the type of words that we use for classifying the criteria. So for instance, at the top of your screen, you can see panel A, economic criteria. And right below that, there are 4 categories: general, labor, education, and wealth. So these are the words that we use to classify ads published in Canada. And for instance, if you look at the first line for the general economic criteria, we're going to say that an ad mentions economic criteria if it contains the word background, budget, finances, income, means, money, position, or wage. Here you can see that, for instance, we don't put financial, we put finances. We don't put the complete, in other words, the complete version of the word. Why? Well, because we stem the word to get the plural and singular form. And below that, you can see for panel B, panel C, and panel D, all the criteria, the words that we use to classify the matrimonial ads. Okay? So doing that, and that's where then the results are going to start. Our main outcome is the share of words related to a criterion. So coming back to this ad here, from single to serious, what we have here in the demand side is the following part: handsome man, good situation, serious. Here we're going to consider that in this demand side, there is one word related to physical criterion, one word related to situation, to economic criterion, and one word related to personality criterion. Okay. So given that there is one word related to economic criterion, that there are 3 words classified, here we assume, we are going to consider that 33% of words in the demand side are related to economic criteria. Okay, and that's going to be our main outcomes for all the ads. For the full ad using both the supply and the demand side, it will be 2 words out of 7 because secretary in the supply side also refers to economic criteria. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the main results. So these are the main results for the evolution of the demand for economic criteria. So basically here what we see is that in the 2 Western countries, so in Canada and in France, both for ads written by women and written by men, so ads written by women are in graph A, those written by men are in graph B, economic criteria were less and less demanded throughout the century. In France, in 1950, within ads written by women, economic criteria accounted for about 50% of the words in the demand side. And up to 1970, where it started decreasing to reach about 20% in 1995. In Canada, it started at 30% and ended at 10% in 1995. Whereas in India, where it started at about 40%, and if anything, it did not decrease the demand for economic criteria stated in the matrimonial ad, it seems to have increased up to 60%. For men, it's relatively the same graph that we observed, where it started at about the same point in 1955 for India, Canada, and France. And then by 1995, in Canada and France, ads don't mention these economic criteria, whereas in India, they still mention them quite a lot, up to 40% of the work. And well, what has replaced economic criteria in Canada and France are the personality criteria. So personality criteria, again, that's words like being fun, being tender, being nice, being loving, being having a sense of humor, being dynamic, that kind of word. We can see that these words in Canada and France, they used to account for about 20 to 30% of the demand side in Canada and France. And by the end of the century, they account for about 40 to 50%. That's true for women and for men. Whereas in India, the importance of this personality criteria, where it seems to have remained fairly stable over the entire period, at about 10% for both women and men. As for the 2 other criteria, well, for physical criteria, it has remained fairly stable in the 3 countries. The only difference is that in India, for ads written by women, it seems to have decreased a bit, implying that women specify less the physical features of their ideal partner, starting from 1975 to 1995. And for taste criteria, it also has remained stable over this entire period. Again, taste criteria, that demographic criteria, and also the mention of hobby. And we can see that in India it's higher than in the other countries because they mention caste quite a lot. Now that for the demand side, what you could wonder is what about the supply side? So the demand side is where you describe your ideal partner. The supply side is where you describe what you offer to basically this ideal partner. And what we can see is that also for the supply of economic criteria for ads written by women and by men, well, the supply, it started at about, for instance, 40% in graph B for ads written by men, the supply of economic criteria. It declined progressively over the century to reach 10% in Canada and 20% in France. Whereas in India, it also remains stable throughout the entire period. So implying that, one more time, the supply of economic criteria has decreased. The mention, at least in the supply side of economic criteria, has decreased in both Canada and France, whereas it has remained stable in India. So that's for the main results related to the time series. Now, in terms of limitations of matrimonial ads, they kind of quickly. So just a quick question. I should stop at 8:40.
Sorry,
Yes.
go ahead.
How long do I have left?
You have probably another 10 minutes. So.
Okay. So just very quickly then, there is a number of questions we could wonder. One question we could wonder is to what extent basically we use very specific newspapers. So to what extent the results are driven by these three newspapers that we use in India, France, and Canada? How would the results change if we were to have taken another newspaper? So to answer that question, we constituted the dataset to study cross-sectional variations at what point in time from 45 English-speaking newspapers in 1995 in the US and Canada to measure variation between newspapers outlets. And what we obtained, well, it's this graph. So on the x-axis of this graph, you have the state of, well, the provinces for Canada, so the regions of Canada or the regions of the US, for ads written by women and ads written by men. And what we can see here is that the gray dots are the share of personality criteria demanded in all these ads, where they're consistently ranked as the most sought for criteria in all the states or provinces, both for ads written by women and ads written by men. Whereas the black dots are the economic criteria, where the weight of economic criteria in the demand side, and they account for about 10% of the demand side in all these states or provinces, suggesting that over space, where there is limited variation in terms of the demand for criteria in a potential partner, and suggesting that the choice of these newspapers don't drive the results. Another point is, what about the composition effect? We could wonder. So it's not a representative survey, which means that perhaps the pool of ad writers changes over time. So maybe, for instance, in 1955, it was mostly young people that were writing, and in 1995, it's mostly old people. And maybe this change drives the results. So to answer that question, what we did is a Oaxaca blinded decomposition of the trends through time. We basically use the supply side to build a number of variables, such as the age, marital status, demographics, religion, and so on. And we decompose the evolution of the trend. And what we attempt to measure is what we cannot explain just based on the demographic of the characteristics of ad writer. And what we cannot explain are these following trends, where we see that, for instance, in France and Canada, there is still this decline of the demand for economic criteria, whereas in India, there is this rise or stability, suggesting that changing pool of ad writers, well, as we measure them, they don't explain the results. And finally, another point we could wonder is, we could ask is, what about changes in language over 50 years? For instance, few people talk about financial means today. They don't use this word means, whereas in 1955, in Canada, when you were talking about the financial situation of a potential partner, the word means was used a lot. So in other words, these dictionaries, they could be biased through time. And in the common day, in the daily language, maybe we just use the words related to economic criteria less and less. So to address this point, what we did is that we took data from Google and Graham, which has 6% of the books ever published in English, and computed the evolution of our dictionaries over time. And what we find is the following, where in books written in English, basically using the same dictionaries, we have economic criteria that are mentioned a lot more than personality test or physical criteria. And the ranking does not seem to change in this book, suggesting that language transformation don't drive the results. And we also implemented some robustness checks on the methodological choices, but I will pass that to basically go to the last question, to the last section, which is the discussion on the mechanism. So the question is, well, what could explain these results? So we consider so far, so it's a work in progress. If you have suggestions, don't hesitate. We consider so far two broad mechanisms. The first one is the changing prevalence of ads written by parents. So maybe ads were written by parents in the 3 countries in the 1950s and only in India in 2000. And maybe that's why the economic criteria are less and less demanded, because parents have a preference for their children to marry someone with a good economic situation. The second mechanism we are going to consider is the links with the transformation of the family. So in Western countries, there is this question of whether it is the end of traditional family, there is a drop in marriage rate, and maybe that's a consequence of that we're observing in India. So for the first mechanism, we computed the share of ads mentioned in parents in the supply side. So it's quite interesting to do that, because when an ad is written by a parent, well, they say in the supply side, well, we are parents, we are looking for someone like that. And we can see that, well, in basically France and Canada, the mention of parents was a bit more prevalent in the 1950s and 1955, but it was it still remained extremely rare. Less than 5% of ads were mentioning parents in France and Canada. Whereas in India, it remained stable over the entire period. And for ads written by men in graph B, it seems to have increased slightly, suggesting that this parents mechanism, well, it's true that parents write ads more often for their children in India, but it does not seem to have changed that much over the century. And then there is the second type of mechanism linked with the transformation of family. So as I said at the beginning, in the second half of the 20th century, Western family underwent profound changes. There was this drop in marriage rates. Marriage was less and less important. It has been widely described in different disciplines. Many people have talked about the potential determinants of this shift. So to make a link with this, what happens in society, we computed the share of ads mentioning marriage as a goal of the relationship. So what people used to say is in the demand side, they were mentioning marriage. They are saying, I'm looking for that person. The objective is marriage. And if it is linked to, if our rates are linked to the transformation of the family in Western countries, well, we should observe a declining mention of marriage in the 2 Western countries and not in India. And that's exactly actually what we observe. So in France and Canada, we see that, for instance, in graph A, ads written by women from 1950 to 1970, 1975, 80 to 90% of ads were mentioning marriage as a goal for the relationship. And this has declined to less than 10% by the end of the century. Whereas in India, it remains more or less stable over the entire period. It seems to have declined a bit, but not that much, just about 10 percentage points, whereas in the 2 other countries, it basically disappears. Which brings us to the title of the paper called A Hierarchy of Partner Preferences. So this shift in preferences that we document from economic to non-economic criteria is closely linked to what Engelhardt called in 1977 the rise of post-materialism. So what Engelhardt argued is that people were increasingly valuing post-materialistic values in politics, such as autonomy and self-expression, basing his results on Maslow's theory of needs, where there is a pyramid of needs, where first you have materialistic values, materialistic needs, and then you move on to post-materialist values. And what we argue so far in the paper is that this is what we observe in the partner preferences, where we have a similar result, a shift from economic to non-economic criteria in Western countries, which is similar to the post-materialistic view of Ingela. And that concludes the presentation, I think, on time. In the paper, we show how partner preferences have evolved. Main result is that in the two Western countries, there is a decline of economic criteria and rise of personality criteria. In India, this relative stability. Well, in terms of future research, how to improve the paper, we are very interested in potential suggestions. What we thought of is perhaps extend the data set, try to, well, perhaps identify better the mechanism, but if you have other suggestions or other sources of data that come to mind, do not hesitate. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lippmann. This is very interesting and actually very interesting source of data and very informative. For this moment, may I ask if anyone in here have any questions or any comments? Professor Yong Yoon, please.
Good afternoon and good morning as well. Yes, thank you for the interesting paper. I was laughing halfway through with very many, talking about marriage is always in sometimes funny, sometimes serious, sometimes very complicated. And thank you for trying to present a model that tries to describe the evolution of what you call partner preferences over time. I want to bring some ideas onto the table and maybe a few correlates with the paper. First of all, I find that the perspective is very Western. So it's really, I mean, you're looking at the marriage market from a very Western perspective, meaning that, you think there is some kind of a free market, open market system. And I like it the way you said that the markets, the marriage market can constrain, is a constraining factor to how marriage outcomes happen and so on and so forth. That was a good point, but whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not so sure. The point I want to really make is that for example, in Korea, where I come from, much of what happens in the marriage market happens in what we call, I think the English term is marriage makers. So it's not really like an open kind of system, but there are institutions where the marriage maker would connect potential husbands and wives. And that seems to be completely, I know you addressed some of things here very lightly, but that is completely missing from your paper. And why is that important is because if you flip it on the other side, because first of all, you have advertisements from Canada and from France, the Western countries, where I think where individual preferences are more or can be more important. But in Eastern societies, it's of course individual preferences are important and are becoming increasingly more important. But when it comes to the idea of marriage, I still think the traditional and the family kind of ideas prevail more strongly. And in that case, your study does not capture that. So there could be some kind of sample selection problem there. That's one point. And again, when you talk about India, you bring English, you collect your data from English newspapers. And again, I think Indian people who are inclined to use those papers may have values which are aligned with Western preferences rather than their own tradition. I don't know, it's just an assumption that I feel worth looking at. I think those are the two things, and maybe something that, going back to the extent of the market, I think you may know that in Korea, actually, the rate of marriages decline, fertility is declining, and so on and so forth. It could be, I think, too much information rather than lack of information, because with the online situation, Young people nowadays know too much, so they don't want to get into the marriage trap, so to speak, and try to avoid it somehow. And as a last point, one thing that you could also factor in is that if you compare the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and so forth, we're also getting a situation where people are living longer. So I think when you create a family, it's all you need to, of course, the issues of, you talked about fertility, able to control your how you reproduce. You talk about the ability to divorce and how maybe the society perceives divorce, etc. But when you talk about marriage itself, I think because the elderly are living longer, there is the element of families having to look after the elderly as well. So maybe that can factor into whether these things make sense to get married or not. Yeah, those are my small comments. Otherwise, thank you so much for the very interesting talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Yong-Yun. And we also have one relevant question from Dash Sunil in the chat box, like talking about the TOI mostly caters to urban population. Does it mean this finding is not related to rural population? This is one point that Professor Yong-Yun also raised, that is like an English newspaper. So that would be some selection bias. So would you like to respond or get more questions first?
Yeah, I can respond to this point. So first of all, thank you very much for the comment. I think that's very valid comment. So first on the first point of the Western perspective. So in a sense, what I would say that you are entirely right. Basically, how we come up with the idea of this paper is to try to test what was happening in Western countries first. So we had the data on France, we looked for another Western countries, and then we tried to look for a counter example, and we only found data from India. So that's how we did the data collection, focusing mainly on what has been described in Western countries, which I think has been described a lot more in the existing literature than what was happening in non-Western countries. So it's true. It's entirely true that, for instance, in India, you mentioned also Korea, marriages were done through marriage makers and institutions. And that's also what we try to address in one of the mechanisms, saying that, for instance, perhaps in India, there is like parents that are writing these ads a lot more than in the two Western countries. But on top of parents, there could be other types of institutions leading to marriage. But on this point, I think that's part of the answer. From my perspective, is that also in Western countries in 1950s, in 1955, in 1960, the weight of society, of other institutions was a lot more prevalent than it is today. And today, marriage and finding a partner in Western countries is something that is more individual, whereas it used to be a lot more collective decision before. And that's what we kind of try to describe here. That's definitely part of the mechanism we describe here, where in the 70s in Western countries, there is this growing individualization that happens and that is different from non-Western countries. Then on the question of India, I think both in the chat and what you say also was that we use an English-speaking newspapers in India. It's mainly urban population. It's mainly the highly educated ones. So what we're trying to do right now is to get some Hindi newspapers in India to try to see how the results would change. That would be interesting. Now, the other point I want to say on that is that we have urban population, English-speaking newspapers close to the elite. And I think in terms of how we could bias the results, is that we should expect like economic criteria to be a bit less prevalent within this set of individuals. That's what I would expect, because that's the people that are the most exposed to Western culture, to cultural change, not necessarily the rural ones. So it could be interesting still to have some different newspapers. Hindi newspaper would be very interesting. That's what we're trying to do. But thank you. Is there any other question?
Thank you very much. Okay, so I can see that Jessica has her hand up. So
Okay.
Thank you so much for such an interesting paper. And of course, I mentioned to you before, I love the original paper on France, and my student, one of my students who read the paper for class with me is actually here today as well. I had a couple of questions. I just was pondering the difference between France and Canada with the economic criteria preferences, because I was actually quite surprised to see that for Canada, economic concerns were consistently less than it was for France. And I was trying to understand, trying to think of, is there a reason for that? I thought they would be very, very similar to each other. And one of the things that kind of brought up for me was the actual cost of putting in an ad. So is this really a function of greater opportunities for women in Canada to have, kind of independent economic means, particularly further back in time? Or is this potentially a reflection of a relatively relative differences in the cost of putting in the ads? And so we see differences in how many words they're kind of sort of like this quota of words that they could use for the different types of criteria. So that's one thing. The other thing for the Indian case, I was wondering if you had any plans or had thought about connecting this with any of the dowry literature, particularly like the hedonic pricing of spousal characteristics, and seeing if there have been changes over time. And I don't know the literature very well, but do we see kind of different differences in pricing of spousal characteristics on the marriage market through some of these dowry studies? And that might be something kind of interesting to look at, to see if we see sort of this relative stability in terms of the economic criteria versus like physical criteria and so on.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the question. So on the first point, on the difference between France and Canada, you're right. We should, in terms of levels, it's different. It was puzzling for us too. It's true that in France, well, I don't think it could be a reflection of the cost of the ad. In Canada, it's a lot less expensive than in France. In France, by the end of the century, basically, it's about what would be 60 euros to write a 20-word ad. So that's $80 US. That's not nothing, really. It's quite something, and this could explain the difference. But I think what I did not show here is the decomposition of the criteria. The big difference from France and Canada comes from wealth criteria. Like in France, people are really looking for people who are going to inherit, who have a big wealth, who have apartments, who have houses, who have that kind of things. And this does not show at all in Canada. In Canada, people are looking for people who have a good job, but not for people who have, let's say, very good inheritance potential or wealth. And I think here it's part of the difference between the two countries, where there was a weight of inheritance has been shown to be very heavy in France, and a lot heavier in France than in, for instance, North American countries, where jobs are more important. And for India, well, to be honest, we are we're still at the beginning of analyzing the Indian data set because it's well, we try here to in the presentation to make well, something consistent, but I think we're still missing something with India. For instance, in India there is this also this caste thing that is very important in India and does not happen at all in the two other countries, and I don't mention it at all in the paper. But it's really the big difference between the Indian data set and the two Western countries. So we're going to try other things and try to dive deeper in the data set for sure in the future. But thank you for the time.
Okay, thank you very much. I actually have one question / comment. It's like you present like a bigger picture of the information of criteria, right? Like the graph showing economic is important or personality or test, but did you check like if a person who on the supply side say that I am economically stable, do I look for someone the same as me, you know, like, so if the supply side focus on economic, would the demand side be economic as well? Or if the supply side is like, I have a fun personality, am I looking for the same? Or like people search for someone who are different?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think what you're mentioning is the possibility of assortative mating. So you have a given characteristic, you're looking for someone who has the same characteristics. So that's on our to-do list. That's something we've done so far just for France, and something we're going to do for also India and Canada. Yeah, that's quite interesting. So far, we don't have results on that for the two other countries, but we're definitely going to dive into that. Thank you.
That would be very interesting. We have
thank you.
Another question from Professor Yong Yun from marriage maker market in Korea. There is a lot of data available. If you are interested with text analysis, you can easily translate this document. So you can add another country for comparison. And also interesting note is that first question, the questionnaire for marriage seeker is what is your blood type? Wow. Okay. So very physical characteristic blood type. It's quite important in Asia, though. Sometimes we. Okay. So are there any last questions for today before 2 p.m.? Okay. If there is no questions, I would like to thank Professor Rickman very much for such an interesting topic. So if there are any comment or any other things, please feel free to contact us. We can manage for further discussion. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. And I will be interested in the Korean stuff. If you can send me the stuff, I'd be very interested.
Yes, please. Yeah, we can continue this discussion. I know a few researchers who are working on this. I can definitely link you up with them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you again. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.